I have told this story exactly twice in my life. The first time, I told it to a Colonial Infrastructure Authority debrief panel on Varath Station, under oath, with a recording light blinking red above the interviewer's left shoulder. The second time, I told it to my sister over a very bad bottle of wine on a night she needed distraction, and I needed to say it out loud again to remember it was real. Both times, the people listening went quiet in a way that told me they were deciding whether I was lying or whether I had come unmoored from sanity somewhere in the outer transit lanes. I don't blame them. I have no evidence. I have no recording. I have not even a single intact sensor log from that day, because when it happened, every sensor on the relay station went dark for 11 minutes and came back empty. What I have is this. My hand remembers the temperature of that surface, not in the way you remember a temperature, not as a fact, not as a calibration entry in a maintenance log. My hand remembers it the way a body remembers the particular warmth of a thing that recognized it. I am 51 years old. I have been a colonial infrastructure maintenance technician for 23 of those years. I have put my hands on more alien surfaces than I can count. None of them felt like that. Not one. So I'll tell it again, a third time. And I'll tell it plainly, the way I tell everything, because plain is the only register I know, and because the truth of it does not need embellishment. The truth of it was and is, and will remain more than enough. My posting to the relay station on Carathvel was a 6-week solo rotation, which was not unusual. Relay maintenance in the outer colonial grid is, by design, a solitary occupation. The stations themselves are too small to justify a crew, the work is too specialized to bundle with other infrastructure trades, and the locations are too remote to make the transit economics of a full team make any sense. You go out alone. You spend your weeks running diagnostics and replacing burned components and logging fault codes, and then you go home. I had done 41 such rotations in the previous decade. I was good at the solitude. Some people are not. I have known maintenance techs who burned through 2 or 3 outer rotations before the isolation pruned them back toward inner grid work, where the population density and the casual human noise of shared facilities holds the edges of a person together. I understood those people. I had nothing against them. I simply did not share their need. The solitude, for me, had never been the hard part. The hard part was always the work itself. Not because the work was beyond my capability, but because it demanded the full weight of my attention for weeks at a stretch, and I am the kind of person who finds that demand more sustaining than exhausting. The silence lets me think. The isolation lets me hear the systems I am responsible for without the background noise of other people's opinions and priorities getting between me, and what the equipment is actually telling me. Carathvel is a moon. It orbits a gas giant called Tavan-Keth in a system designated CV7 in the colonial infrastructure grid, which is the kind of name that tells you everything you need to know about how interesting anyone back in central administration thought the place was. The moon itself is beautiful if you have the taste for cold beauty. Most people don't. It has a thin atmosphere, breathable only with a supplemental mask below 3,000 meters, and a surface of gray-green volcanic stone that has been cooling and cracking for longer than human civilization has existed. The plateau where the relay station sits is at roughly 4,000 meters, which means a full respirator is required outside the station shell, and the wind comes off the northern escarpment in long, flat curtains that sound, if you let yourself hear it that way, like something large is sighing out there in the dark. I let myself hear it that way. On most nights, I found it settling rather than ominous, the sound of a very old landscape doing what very old landscapes do, which is exhale. I arrived on Carathvel on a standard short-hop transit from the CV7 processing hub, 62 hours in a single-occupancy cabin with a bunk, a fold-down desk, and a viewport that showed me nothing particularly interesting except the slow brightening of Tavan-Keth as we closed on the system. I used the transit time to read the site file in full. This is my habit before any rotation, not because the pre-departure briefing is insufficient, but because the site file contains the details that briefing summaries edit out in the interest of efficiency, and it is in the edited-out details that work either holds together or falls apart. The fault logs for the transmitter array, the maintenance history going back to the last 2 rotations, the CAS notation on the alien infrastructure. The relay station had been established approximately 80 years prior, in the early expansion push into the CV corridor. It was a standard colonial infrastructure installation, a pressure dome about 15 meters across, a transmitter array on a mast above it, and a subsurface equipment vault accessed by a ladder through a hatch in the dome floor. My job for the 6 weeks was to replace 12 fatigued conduit sections in the vault, recalibrate the transmitter array, and complete a full systems inventory of everything in the structure. This last task included the alien infrastructure. That is a phrase colonial infrastructure uses carefully and without apology. Alien infrastructure. The station on Carathvel had been built into the ruins of an older structure, one of several dozen relay points across the CV corridor that the original colonial surveyors had established on sites that were already impossibly sites. That word sites is the official vocabulary, and it carries more weight than its 4 letters suggest. It means something was here first. Something built here, maintained something here, used this location for a purpose we have not determined. Colonial infrastructure policy, at the time of my rotation, was to document and preserve alien infrastructure where encountered, to avoid disturbing it where possible, and to flag any anomalies in the inventory log for later assessment by the Colonial Archaeology Survey. The CAS, as a rule, got to anomaly-flagged sites somewhere between 18 months and never. Their funding situation was chronic. I had worked on 3 sites with alien infrastructure before Carathvel. 2 were on moons in the Pellerin chain, stub remnants of what looked like carved load-bearing structures, very old, completely inert. The 3rd was a set of floor channels on a small asteroid that one of the early surveyors had optimistically interpreted as a manufacturing facility, though the CAS had quietly downgraded that assessment to possible water routing system, and then to uncertain, and then to the notation that followed me to Carathvel. Documented, no current action required. I had learned over those 3 sites how to treat alien infrastructure with appropriate attention and appropriate detachment. You log it. You don't touch it if you can avoid it. You do not speculate in your official documentation, because speculation attracts CAS attention, which brings a full team through a site and delays your work by months. You note the dimensions, the material composition where your scanner can reach it, the state of preservation, and you move on. This was my operating posture when I descended the ladder into the vault on Carathvel at approximately 900 on my 9th day of the rotation. The vault was roughly 8 meters on a side, low-ceilinged, just enough clearance to stand upright if you were under average height, which I am not, so I moved through it in a slight constant crouch. The colonial infrastructure equipment lined 3 walls, conduit racks, power distribution panels, cooling assemblies, the interface terminals for the transmitter array. Standard issue, everything labeled in colonial standard script, everything organized according to the infrastructure field manual that hadn't changed significantly in 30 years. I had replaced components in vaults that looked essentially identical to this one on 4 other moons and 2 planetary surfaces. The familiarity was a comfort. I worked best when I could move without thinking about the container. The 4th wall was not colonial infrastructure. I had read the site file before departure. I knew the 4th wall was there. I had the survey photographs from the original installation team, 80 years old and slightly blurred from whatever imaging equipment they had been using. I had the CAS note which said, "Singular fixed element, alien manufacture, non-reactive, undamaged, no known function, preserve in place." I had the dimensions, roughly 4 meters wide, 3 meters high, carved or formed from the same gray-green volcanic stone as the plateau surface above, set flush against the bedrock as though it had grown from it. And at its center, suspended, that was the word in the file, suspended, with no explanation of by what mechanism. A crystal node approximately 60 centimeters across and 40 deep, faceted in a pattern too regular to be natural, too complex to be decorative, too precise to be accidental. Crystal was opaque. That was in the file too. Opaque, color gray-white, no internal luminosity detected, no electromagnetic signature, no thermal differential from ambient. Inert. All of those words were in the file in the CAS notation in the original survey. Inert. I read that word 4 or 5 times over the transit, and I filed it under things that are true about where I am going. I was not apprehensive about the crystal. I had worked around inert alien infrastructure before. You leave it alone. You document it if your rotation requires a full inventory, and you do your job. The first 7 days, I did exactly that. I replaced 8 of the 12 conduit sections. The conduit work was the majority of the physical labor in the rotation, each section requiring a 2-handed pull through a narrow equipment channel, and by day 4 my shoulders had settled into the specific kind of ache that comes from repetitive work in a confined space. I did not complain about this, not even internally. Ache was information. Ache meant work was happening. I recalibrated the transmitter array's primary phase coupling, which had drifted 11% off nominal, a larger drift than the fault logs had suggested, which was irritating, because it meant the station had been running degraded for longer than the automated diagnostics had caught. The automated diagnostics on outer grid stations are, in my experience, optimistic. They are designed to flag problems large enough to require emergency intervention. They are not designed to catch the slow accumulation of small degradations that add up over years to a station running at 70 or 80% of its rated performance, while the fault log says, nominal. I have flagged this gap in the diagnostic protocol twice in my career in official reports and received, both times, a polite acknowledgement and no subsequent action. I had learned to account for it myself. I ate my meals at the fold-down table near the eastern equipment rack, with my back to the alien wall, because it seemed polite to not stare. I slept in the pressure dome above, in the standard-issue bunk that folded out from the north wall, under a thermal sheet that retained heat poorly but was better than the alternative. I ran my daily systems check at 700 and my secondary at 1900. I listened to the wind come off the northern escarpment at night. I did not touch the crystal. On day 9, I began the full inventory. The Colonial Infrastructure Field Manual defines a full inventory as a complete physical and electronic documentation of all equipment, structures, and features within the station boundary, including anomalous or non-standard elements. The non-standard elements inventory has its own subsection, which provides a specific protocol for alien infrastructure, visual documentation, dimensional logging, surface material scan where non-invasive, and notation of current state. The scan was the operative question. The manual says non-invasive. My scanner, a standard CI4 field unit, reads surface composition via a low-power electromagnetic pulse that the documentation describes as having, quote, negligible potential for interaction with materials of unknown manufacture. I had used the CI4 on alien infrastructure twice before. Both times it had returned a partial or inconclusive read. Alien materials tend to scatter the CI4's pulse in ways the unit's firmware does not know how to interpret, and both times nothing had happened beyond the scanner giving me a shrug in data form. I spent the first 3 hours of the inventory working through the Colonial infrastructure equipment on the 3 standard walls, a task I could do with most of my attention, since I had logged similar equipment on dozens of prior rotations, and the variables were narrow. The 4th wall and its crystal node I saved for last. This was deliberate. Not from apprehension, but from the professional habit of doing familiar work before unfamiliar work, so that, when you arrive at the thing that may require improvisation, your hands are warm, and your attention is fully committed rather than arriving pre-tired from the transition. I positioned myself in front of the crystal at 10:23. I had my scanner in my right hand. I had my documentation tablet in my left. I was wearing my full vault kit work suit, gloves, respirator clipped to my belt, though not on my face, inside the pressurized structure. I noted the time. I noted the crystal's apparent state: opaque, gray-white, no visible change from survey photographs taken 80 years prior. I noted that the suspension mechanism remained undetermined. From this close, approximately 30 centimeters, I could confirm that the crystal did not rest on any visible support structure. It hung in the air above a shallow carved depression in the stone mounting frame, equidistant from the four walls of that frame, with roughly 8 centimeters of open air between its lower facet and the stone beneath. I logged this. I noted: suspension mechanism not identified, consistent with prior documentation, no physical alteration detected. I initiated a scan from approximately 30 centimeters distance. The CI4 pulsed. The crystal did not respond. The scanner returned: material classification unknown, lattice structure non-standard, internal composition indeterminate. I logged all of this. I noted: consistent with prior documented state, no anomaly detected. Then I reached out and put my bare left hand flat against the lower facet of the crystal. I want to be honest about why I did that, because it matters. It was not curiosity. It was not recklessness. It was not a moment of sentiment or a sudden irrational impulse. I had set my tablet down on the equipment rack behind me to free up my hand for the scanner, and when I turned back to the crystal to log the final measurement, its vertical height from the floor, which the previous documentation listed as 112 centimeters to the base of the crystal. I misjudged my distance in the low light of the vault, and my palm made contact with the crystal's surface before I had registered I was close enough to touch it. That is the truth of it. 23 years of careful, methodical, professional work in colonial infrastructure maintenance, and the moment that changed the shape of my understanding of what I am and what humanity carries in its bloodstream happened because I miscalculated by 8 centimeters in a dim underground room. The surface was warm. Not warm the way a powered component is warm, not the dry artificial warmth of a battery or a processor running under load. Warm the way a living thing is warm, or the way stone holds the warmth of a sun that set hours ago. Warm the way a hand is warm when someone else closes theirs around it. I registered this before I registered anything else, and my first professional instinct was to pull my hand back and check my gloves. I looked down. My gloves were hanging from my belt. My left hand, bare, was flat against the lower facet of the crystal, and the crystal was warm, and for 3 full seconds I did not do anything except note that fact. Then the light came. It started at the point of contact, at the exact center of my palm, and moved outward through the crystal's internal structure the way water moves through cracked stone, along pathways that already existed, along lines of least resistance that turned out to be everywhere. Not a single color, but a sequence of them, deep gray first, almost invisible against the crystal's natural opacity, and then blue, the particular blue of high-altitude sky at the edge where atmosphere becomes nothing, and then something between white and silver that did not have a name I could apply to it. The light did not pulse. It did not flicker. It moved through the crystal with the steady, deliberate progress of something that has been waiting a very long time to move, and is in no hurry now that the waiting is over. I did not remove my hand. This is something I have thought about many times since. The rational response, the trained response, the response consistent with 23 years of working carefully around things I did not understand, was to step back, log the change in state, and contact the CAS emergency line. I know this. I knew it then. My hand stayed on the crystal. I cannot explain this as professionalism or scientific judgment. What I can tell you is that the warmth under my palm changed quality when the light appeared, and that the change was specific. It went from the warmth of stored heat to the warmth of active attention, and everything in my body understood the difference before my mind had processed it. Something was noticing my hand. Something was noticing me. And in the 14 seconds between the moment the light appeared and what happened next, I made no decision to stay. I simply could not find the interior motion that would have constituted choosing to leave. The light reached the upper facets of the crystal, and the vault changed. Changed is not quite right. The vault remained the vault, the equipment racks were still there, the conduit sections still ran their courses along the south wall, the hatch above me was still the hatch. What changed was the air. I know how that sounds, but the air in that vault had been, for 9 days, the air of a sealed working space, the faint recycled quality of filtered atmosphere, the smell of insulation and metal, and the particular blankness of spaces that have been closed a long time. When the light reached the upper facets, the air changed. Not the temperature, not the composition. My belt sensor would have alerted me to any atmospheric change. The quality of the air, the weight of it. It became, in a way I could feel in my chest before I could articulate it, old, not stale, old. The way standing in certain ruins is old, not because the air itself has been there since the founding, but because everything the air is touching has been there since the founding, and the air knows it and carries the knowing. The crystal began to sound. Not loudly, not in any frequency I would describe as music or language or alarm. It was a sustained resonance in the material itself, the kind of vibration that a large bell makes not when it is struck, but in the seconds after, the long settling of something that has been moved. The sound came through the floor into my boots, and through my palm into my arm, and I felt it in my back teeth, and in a place behind my sternum that I do not have a clinical name for. The resonance was not random. I am not a physicist, but I am a maintenance technician, which means I have spent 2 decades learning to distinguish between the sounds of systems in distress and the sounds of systems in operation, and what I felt in that vault was the latter. Not malfunction, operation. Something had started running. I heard the transmitter array come online above me. It should not have been online. I had shut it down 4 days earlier for the phase recalibration and had not yet brought it back up. That was work scheduled for day 11. The array's activation sequence has a particular sound, a low rising tone from the mast coupling, then the sharp click of the phase rotors locking into position, then the hum of the transmitter field building to operational strength. I heard all 3 of those sounds in sequence in the 11 minutes that followed. I heard the vault's backup power system engage. I heard the station's secondary atmospheric processor cycle up. I heard, faintly and then more clearly, the sound of the station's communication terminal activating in the dome above, the specific triple-tone chime that means the system is acquiring a signal and preparing to transmit. None of this was possible from inside the vault with the primary control terminal locked. None of it was possible from the crystal's contact point, which my scanner had logged as having no electromagnetic signature an hour earlier. I stood with my palm on the crystal's lower facet, and the station came alive around me without my hands on a single control surface, and the sound in the crystal's structure deepened from resonance into something I can only describe as voice, not language, not yet, but the quality of voice, the sense that a frequency is carrying intention and not merely physics. The light in the upper facets changed color. I had read, in the CAS general file on alien infrastructure in the CV corridor, that there were 17 documented relay stations with alien origin elements similar to those on Karath Vel. The CAS's working hypothesis, at the time my rotation file was compiled, was that the alien structures predated the CV system's colonial settlement by somewhere between 40,000 and 200,000 years. That range tells you how little they actually knew. The materials used in the construction, the faceted crystal nodes, the carved stone mounting structures, the unexplained suspension mechanism, were consistent across all 17 sites. The CAS had a name for the builders, which was not a real name but a designation, the prior network. It was the kind of name that means, we do not know who they were, but we know they were first, and we know they built something that connected to itself across distances we cannot measure, and we know it stopped working at some point and has been stopped ever since. Stop, that was also a word in the file. The crystal nodes were stopped, not broken, not damaged, stopped. I thought about that word while the light changed above me. Stopped is not the same as inert. Stopped is the same as waiting. The color in the upper facets went from that unnamed white silver to a gold that was not gold in any standard material sense. Not the warm yellow of precious metal, not the amber of certain minerals. It was the color of old light, the color of illumination that has traveled an extreme distance and carries the whole of that distance in its quality. It filled the upper portion of the crystal and moved through the lattice toward my palm, moving against the direction the blue had traveled, coming inward instead of outward, and I understood, in the particular understanding that is not thought but recognition, that the crystal had been reading me all along. The outward light had been the system activating. The inward light was the answer. My legs held me up by discipline rather than strength. I was aware of this. I am not a lineage person. I should say that plainly because it matters to what came next. My family is 4 generations of colonial service workers, maintenance technicians, infrastructure crew, one grandmother who did transit scheduling for 30 years before her retirement. We have no documented connection to any of the named founding families of the colonial program. We have no unusual medical markers in our genetic file. I know because the Colonial Health Authority conducts full genetic surveys of all infrastructure personnel for liability reasons, and I have read my file, and it says what it always says. Standard human genomic profile, no notable variants, no flags. We are not people from whom the ancient and the alien should expect anything in particular. We are exactly what we look like. Competent, steady, ordinary people who do necessary work in difficult places and come home and sleep well because we earned it. The gold light reached my palm. I felt it before I understood it, a warmth overlaying the warmth I had already been feeling, but with a different character. The first warmth had been contact, recognition of presence. This warmth was categorization, comparison. The sensation of something taking careful, thorough account of every cell in my hand, my arm, my chest, working inward and upward through my body with the patient thoroughness of a survey, running every scan it was designed to run and returning all results within tolerance. It did not hurt. It was not invasive in any way I can name. It was more like being read than being examined, and not read carelessly, not scanned for a specific piece of information, but read the way you read something that matters, where you are not looking for one fact but for the whole of the thing, because the whole of the thing is what you came for. What I thought about, standing there with the gold light in my palm, was the transit. 62 hours from the CV7 processing hub to Carethville, in a single-occupancy cabin, alone with the site file and the viewport in Tavanketh slowly growing in the dark. I had spent those hours reading about conduit fatigue curves and phase coupling drift and the maintenance history of a transmitter array that nobody had visited in 2 years. I had eaten my meals from the transit ration packs and slept 6 hours each cycle and done my stretches in the narrow aisle between the bunk and the door and thought about the work. Not about what might be waiting at the far end of the trip in an underground vault, about the work, because that is what I do. That is the shape my mind takes when it is pointed at something. It goes to the task. It itemizes what needs doing, sequences the steps, anticipates the obstacles. It does not dramatize. It does not pre-experience. It just organizes toward function. I think about that now, about the shape of that mind, and I think the prior network knew exactly what shape of mind it was designing for. The vault was very quiet. The resonance had faded from the floor and the air, leaving behind a new silence that was the silence of something completed rather than the silence of something absent. The The transmitter array was still running above me. The station systems were still running. But the sound they made now was background, the ordinary sound of a facility in proper operation, and the foreground was only the crystal, only the gold light, only the warmth in my hand, and the sense, which was building now into something I could not contain inside the word sense, that I was standing at the convergence of a very long wait. I am not a person who narrates her own experience in real time. Maintenance work is the opposite of that. You observe, you assess, you act, and you log afterward. I had no words for what was happening while it was happening. I had the specifics, the temperature, the light, the sounds of systems coming online, the quality of the silence that followed. I had the physical fact of my hand on the crystal's surface, and the physical fact of what the crystal was doing under that hand. I did not have language for the scale of it. The scale was not something I had an instrument for. The gold light reached a brightness in which I could not distinguish the crystal from the air around it, and then it contracted. This is the part I have tried to describe most carefully and failed most consistently. The light did not go out. It did not fade. It contracted, gathered itself inward from the edges of the crystal's facets to a single point at the center, at the approximate geometric heart of the structure. And for 3 seconds that point was brighter than I could look at directly, and I looked at it anyway, and then the light released. Not outward, downward first, through the suspension gap and into the stone mounting frame, and then upward through the lattice in a motion I can only describe as a breath, an inhalation drawn to its limit and then released all at once. The light moved through the upper mounting structure, and into the stone of the wall behind it, and then into the floor and then into the bedrock beneath the floor, and I felt it through my boots as a single low pulse that moved outward in every direction simultaneously, the way a stone moves water when you drop it from height. And I knew, in the way you know things that your body tells you before your mind has organized the information, that what had just happened was not local, that what had just happened had traveled, that somewhere in a network I could not see and could not map and had not known to look for, something had just received confirmation of something it had been waiting to confirm for a very long time. My hand was still on the crystal. The gold light was gone. The crystal had returned in appearance to its prior state, opaque, gray-white, no visible luminosity, but it was still warm, not the warmth of stored heat, still the warmth of active attention. Still I could feel noticing me. The notice had not ended. It had simply completed one stage of its work and moved to the next. The crystal spoke. I have tried to describe the nature of that voice more times than I can count, and I always arrive at the same inadequate set of descriptions, so I will give them all and let you choose what to do with them. It was not a sound that traveled through air. It was not a sound that came from any particular direction. It was not a sound in the frequency range my ears are equipped to register, and yet I heard it with absolute clarity. It was not produced by any vibrating surface I could identify, and yet it had the quality of a voice, not a synthesized voice, not a mechanical voice, not a recorded voice, but a voice that had been produced by something that had practiced the act of communication and understood that the value of that act lay in being understood. It was patient. It was neither warm nor cold in emotional register. It was old in the way that certain stones are old, not in a way that diminishes it, but in a way that makes the weight of it particular and irreducible. It spoke 5 words. 5 words, and I will tell them to you exactly as I heard them, and I will tell you that I have never repeated them aloud to anyone except my sister on that wine night, because saying them aloud does something to me that I have not found a way to prepare for. They settle on me, every time. Remembered, last keeper of the first threshold. I stood in the vault for a long time after that. I do not know exactly how long. My suit chronometer logged the time of the crystal's light event as approximately 10:31, and the next entry in my scanner's automatic log is 12:14, when I ran a systems diagnostic on the transmitter array from inside the vault. So somewhere between 1 and 2 hours. I stood with my hand on the crystal, which stayed warm, and I turned those 5 words over in my mind the way you turn a stone you have found somewhere significant, checking each face of it, trying to understand what you are holding. Remembered, not recognized, not identified, not designated, remembered, the past tense of memory. The crystal had not concluded something new about me in those 11 minutes of light and resonance. It had recovered something it had already known, something that had been in its records or its architecture, or whatever the correct word is for the organizational structure of a system that was built by a civilization we call the prior network because we don't know what they called themselves. Something about me had been in there already, waiting to be matched to whoever walked in and put a hand on it. And the match had been made, and the word for what it was, for what that match constituted, was remembered. Last keeper of the first threshold. I turned that phrase over a long time as well. Last keeper is not a title of power, I noticed. It is a title of responsibility. The keeper of something is the person who maintains it, who watches it, who makes sure it continues to function and is not lost. I have spent 23 years being exactly that person, for facilities ranging from routine to critical, on moons and stations and planetary surfaces across 4 grid sectors. The Colonial Infrastructure Authority hired me to keep things running, and I have kept things running, and the word keeper has been implicit in my job title for my entire adult life without ever appearing in the formal text of it. It has been there in the work itself, in the morning diagnostic, in the precise torque applied to a conduit fitting, in the hours spent cross-checking fault logs against performance curves to find the drift that the automated system missed. The keeping was always there. I just did not know the full name of what I was keeping. First threshold. I do not know with precision what that means. I have turned it over long enough to have some thoughts about it which I hold carefully and without certainty. A threshold is a boundary, a crossing point. The place where one condition ends and another begins. The first threshold may be the earliest point in whatever network the prior network built, the origin relay, the founding station, the place where the system was first established and from which everything else extended. It may be the threshold between a network at rest and a network in operation, the point at which a stopped system becomes, again, a running one. Or it may refer to something I have no framework for at all, a threshold in a sense the prior network understood, and we have not yet developed the vocabulary to imagine. I do not know. I hold not knowing without distress. 23 years of maintenance work teaches you the discipline of acting correctly in the presence of incomplete information, because complete information is a theoretical state that the actual physical universe rarely provides. Last, that word sits heaviest. Not first keeper, not chief keeper, last, which means the others are gone, or the lineage has thinned to a thread, or the keeping has passed through many hands across a very long time and arrived, at the end of that passage here, in a maintenance technician from a family of service workers on a cold moon at 4,000 meters, with a respirator clipped to her belt and a CI4 scanner in her right hand. Last does not mean final in the sense of terminal. I have thought about this at length, and I have come to believe that the distinction matters. A last keeper is still a keeper. The last person holding the door is still holding the door. The weight of last is the weight of knowing you are at the end of a line that started before you can see, not the weight of knowing the line ends with you. I think the line does not end with me. I am not certain of this. I hold it without certainty the way I hold the rest of it. I have a daughter, she is 19, works transit logistics for the inner grid, shows no inclination toward field work or solitary rotations or alien moons. She is organized, capable, good at sequencing and resource management, exactly the kind of person you want running a transit hub. I have not told her about Carethvel. I think about whether I should. I think about what it means to carry a lineage you didn't know about and whether the carrying is diminished if the lineage is unnamed. I have not resolved this. She seems happy, and happy is not a thing I want to interfere with without very good reason. I eventually removed my hand from the crystal. The warmth diminished by degrees, not cut off, not withdrawn, but fading the way light fades at the end of a long day, slowly, and with the kind of gradual quality that gives you time to notice each stage of the diminishing. When my hand was fully free and hanging at my side, the crystal was gray-white and opaque and entirely still, and the vault was the vault, and the station was running above me with the quiet competence of a facility that had been properly activated. And I stood very still for another few minutes, just confirming that the world had not changed shape around me. It had not. The walls were where they had been. The conduit racks were undisturbed. The hatch above me let in the faint mechanical hum of the dome's atmospheric processor, which was running at a slightly higher output than usual. I noted this for the log. The transmitter array was online. The world was, in all its measurable aspects, the same world it had been when I descended the ladder that morning. The only thing that had changed was what I understood myself to be standing inside. I logged the event in my daily field notes under the heading, Anomaly, Nature Undetermined, No Physical Damage or Hazard Detected, CAS Notification Recommended. I kept the language spare, which is my habit and also, in this case, my preference. The form has limited space for anomaly descriptions, and I have no inclination to overwrite it. I noted the time of the event, the duration, the observable changes in the crystal's state, the spontaneous activation of station systems, and the return of all systems to prior operational parameters at the conclusion. I did not note the 5 words. They belonged to me, and to no official record, and I made that decision in the moment I picked up my documentation tablet and felt the weight of the thing I was deciding not to write down. I notified the CAS emergency line. The duty officer on the other end of that call received my description of the 11-minute event with the combination of skepticism and bureaucratic proceduralism that I had expected, and told me a CAS field team would be dispatched to the site within 6 to 8 weeks, which in practice meant 4 months, which in practice meant that by the time anyone else stood in that vault, my rotation was over and I was home, and the crystal was opaque again, and the CAS team found nothing. No anomalous energy readings, no changes from the prior documented state, no explanation for the 11-minute gap in my sensor logs. Their report notation was, Technician report reviewed, no physical evidence to support anomalous event, site status unchanged, no further action required. I have that report. I have read it many times. I do not dispute any of its factual claims. It is simply not the whole story. That night, the night of day 9, I went outside. This required the full respirator at 4,000 meters, and the wind was coming hard off the northern escarpment, and the temperature had dropped 20 degrees below what the dome's exterior sensor had logged at midday. I stood on the plateau surface in my insulated suit and respirator and looked up at Keth, which was enormous and banded in deep amber and copper, and dominated the western sky the way things that are genuinely large dominate a horizon. Not dramatically, but with the simple authority of mass that needs no argument. Around it, the CV-7 system's lesser bodies were visible where the atmosphere was thin enough to permit it. 2 small moons, a debris field in the mid-system catching reflected light from the primary star, and at the very edge of resolution, what the charts called a minor planetary body, and what the prior network, I suspected, may have had a more particular name for. I stood there for a long time. The wind made it difficult to hear anything except the wind. The plateau's gray-green stone was dark around me, and the dome behind me cast a low circle of warm light across the nearest few meters of surface, and beyond that circle everything was the cold of a moon at night, which is a cold that comes from every direction simultaneously, because there is nothing overhead to hold heat back from space. I thought about the pulse I had felt through my boots, The way it had moved outward in every direction from the vault below me, through bedrock, through the body of the moon, outward and outward, at whatever speed such things travel in the prior network's architecture. It had gone somewhere. It was still going, probably, in the way that a wave continues past the point where you can see it. Somewhere in the CV corridor, or farther, something was receiving the information that a keeper had been verified at the first threshold. Something was updating its record. Something that had been waiting in the prior network's particular mode of waiting was less alone than it had been when it woke up that morning. I found this settling, the same way the wind was settling. Both of them were larger than me and older than me and entirely indifferent to whether I found them settling or not. That is not a criticism. That is a description of scale. I am a maintenance technician. I have spent my career inside the scale of things that operate with complete indifference to any individual person's comfort. You do not take it personally. You learn the system's requirements and you meet them, and the system continues to function, and that is the whole of what is asked. I went back inside and slept. The day after the event, day 10 of my rotation, I went back into the vault at 900 and completed the inventory. The crystal was opaque. The fourth wall was the fourth wall. The colonial infrastructure equipment on the other three walls was exactly as I had left it, the conduit sections not yet replaced sitting in their labeled brackets, the transmitter array interface running its standard status display. I ran my scanner across the crystal one more time. Material classification unknown, lattice structure non-standard, internal composition indeterminate, no anomaly detected. I stood there for a moment longer than the scan required, my hand at my side this time, not touching anything, and I said nothing because there was nothing to say. I had been heard. The system had done what it was built to do and what I had been built or grown or shaped across generations to participate in. We were finished with that particular transaction, and the work of the remaining 27 days was still waiting for me. I replaced the remaining 4 conduit sections. I brought the transmitter array back online on day 11, exactly as scheduled. I completed the system's inventory, including a full documentation entry for the alien infrastructure, dimensional measurements, material scan results, current state notation, all filed precisely according to the field manual protocol. Inert, I wrote in the state notation box. Consistent with prior documented condition. The word had a different weight than it had the first time I read it, but weight is not the same as inaccuracy. The crystal was, by every measurable standard available to me, inert. What I knew about what inert could conceal, I kept in the part of my report that the form had no box for. In the months after the rotation, I did some private research. Not official research. Not anything the CAS or the Colonial Infrastructure Authority sanctioned or is aware of. Personal reading, accessible archives, the kind of scholarship that accumulates around mystery sites without institutional backing. There is more of it than you might expect, and it is considerably more serious than its unofficial status might suggest. I found a small network of independent researchers. 3 academics who had left institutional appointments under circumstances they describe variously as differences of methodology and political pressure, and in one case, straightforward funding withdrawal, who had been quietly assembling documentation on the prior network's architectural patterns for the better part of a decade. They corresponded by a message board that was not widely indexed and had no affiliation with any colonial institution. I read their work over the course of several months, in the evenings after my shifts, and I found it more rigorously sourced than most of the CAS's official publications on the same subject, which is not a criticism I make lightly, because the CAS employs serious people doing serious work under serious constraints. The independent researchers simply had no institutional incentive to conclude anything in particular, and that freedom had produced a quality of intellectual honesty that the official record sometimes lacks. The researchers who have spent careers thinking about the prior network, without pay without departmental support, without the CAS's access to the primary sites, have a hypothesis that I am not qualified to evaluate and am therefore going to describe without endorsement. The prior network did not build a communications relay. They built a maintenance record. What looks to us like a signal relay, nodes that boost and transmit across interstellar distances, may actually be a monitoring system. Each node in the network tracks the state of a particular threshold, a location, a condition, a relationship between one thing and another that matters to the health of the whole. When a threshold falls into neglect, the node associated with it goes into the held state. When the right person arrives, someone whose lineage or vocation or particular combination of the two matches the threshold's recorded keeper profile, the node wakes up, verifies the match, transmits confirmation to the rest of the network, and resumes active monitoring. If this hypothesis is correct, and I hold it with the same careful uncertainty I hold everything about that day, then what happened in that vault was not a discovery. It was not an activation. It was a check-in. After an interval of unknown but enormous length, a maintenance technician showed up at a relay node, passed a verification sequence she didn't know she was running, and the network logged. Threshold confirmed, keeper present, status nominal. I find this deeply, specifically, personally satisfying in a way that I cannot fully explain without sounding like someone who has confused professionalism with identity. But I have not confused them. They are the same thing. I am what I do. I have spent 23 years making sure that the things I am responsible for continue to work, and the prior network, in whatever the language of their architecture was, looked at what I am and said, yes, this one, this is the keeper. This is the person we designed the record for. Remembered. That word is not small. I know it does not look large on the page. 5 letters, 2 syllables. I have said it to myself on night transits and in debrief rooms, and once, quietly, standing at the kitchen window of my sister's apartment at 2 in the morning while she slept off the wine. Remembered. Not found. Not chosen. Not identified as a candidate and promoted. Remembered. The prior network made a record of something that did not yet exist, a person, a lineage, a quality of attention and vocation, and trusted that time would produce it, and looked up from that record when I put my hand on their crystal and said, yes, that one, that is what we recorded. That is the shape we were waiting for. That is the hand we built the threshold for. They did not need a queen. They did not need a conqueror. They did not need someone who had survived great suffering or proven themselves under extraordinary duress. They needed someone who would show up, alone, on a cold moon, and do the work with full attention and no complaint, and put their hand on the thing that needed their hand, and stand there in the dark vault with the gold light moving through the crystal's lattice, and hold still, and not leave. I do not know what the first threshold is the threshold of. I do not know how many other nodes in the network have woken in the way that Karethvel's woke, or whether Karethvel's was the first, or whether it will be the last, or whether there are others out there in the CV corridor right now, in other vaults on other moons, waiting for other ordinary people to miscalculate their distance in a dim underground room and put a bare hand on something that has been waiting for exactly that contact. I do not know what keeping the first threshold means in practical terms, what action it requires of me beyond the action I have already been taking, what responsibility it carries beyond the responsibility I have already been discharging without knowing its true name. What I know is this: the network is not broken. It was stopped, and it has been stopped for longer than I can frame in terms that mean anything to the part of me that plans rotations and orders conduit sections in bulk. And my hand on that surface, for however long I stood, there was enough to tell at least one node in it that a keeper had arrived. The node did what it was built to do. It logged the confirmation and sent it outward, into the bedrock, into the network, into whatever part of the prior network's architecture is still listening for exactly that pulse. Something somewhere received that pulse. I do not know what it is, or where it is, or whether it has any capacity to respond that I would recognize as response. But I know what a relay is. I have spent my career maintaining them. A relay exists to receive a signal and pass it forward. The pulse that went out from under that vault on Carethvel was received by something designed to receive it, and what that something does with the information, what the network does, now that at least one of its keeper profiles has been matched and confirmed, is not mine to determine. My job is not to determine outcomes. My job is to maintain the function of the systems I am responsible for. My job is to show up and to be capable when I arrive and to stay. I am still doing the work. I have had 6 rotations since Carethvel on 4 different moons and 2 stations. I have not encountered another crystal node. I have not found another 4th wall sitting in the dark waiting. I look now, in a way I did not look before, not obsessively, not with the distraction that would compromise my primary work, but with the particular quality of attention of someone who knows that the prior network's architecture is distributed across places the Colonial Infrastructure Authority catalogs without truly understanding, and that it is patient in a way that makes my 23 years of patient work look like a long afternoon. I read site files more carefully now. I hold the word inert differently than I used to. I note the dimensions of alien infrastructure the way I always have, and I hold still for one extra moment before I begin the measurement, because I have learned that still and alone and present is apparently the exact combination that something very old and very deliberate was looking for. I keep doing my job, I log my diagnostics, I replace fatigued conduit sections, I recalibrate transmitter arrays, I descend into vaults. And sometimes, in the moment before I put my hand on something unfamiliar, I think about that warmth, and I think about that gold light moving inward through faceted gray-white stone, and I think about what it means that something older than every civilization humanity has ever built or found or theorized looked at what I am, at the sum of my years and my vocation and my steady, unremarkable, absolutely sufficient competence, and found in it exactly what it had been waiting to find. They remembered me before I existed. They recorded the shape of what I would become in the architecture of a network that outlasted their own civilization, and they trusted time to produce what they had recorded, and time produced it, and here I am, not extraordinary, not chosen from among thousands as the worthiest or the strongest or the most deserving, simply the one whose hand fit the record, the one who showed up alone on a cold moon and did the work without complaint and put her palm on a surface that needed her palm, because that is what keepers do. They are present. They are steady. They maintain the threshold. That is not a small thing to carry, but I am a keeper. Carrying things is what I do.